the French might have been able to dispense with explicit references to race because, unlike the early Americans, they could assume the race of their vast majority. Be that as it may, America's founding fathers' explicit naming of whiteness as a legal prerequisite would have far-reaching social, cultural, political, and even psychological effects. On the one hand, as Matthew Fry Jacobson points out, America would embrace, and I quote here, the distinctly racial understanding of difference, end of quote. At the same time, however, as Richard Dyer would observe, the very existence of a racialized criterion, laden not only with legal, but with powerful social, cultural, and economic advantages, would engender in every newcomer to this country, this land of immigrants, and inexorably positive phototaxes toward American whiteness. To quote Dyer, he says the following: because whiteness carries such rewards and privileges, the sense that a border that might be crossed and a hierarchy that might be climbed has produced a dynamic that has enthralled people who have had any chance at all of participating in it. Now, as mentioned, by 1870, blackness or African descent would also be identified as a qualifying characteristic for United States citizenship. But blackness by this time, and henceforth, would be recognized as carrying few of the fringe benefits of whiteness. As a result, between 1878 and 1952, when race was dropped as consideration for citizenship, virtually none of the immigrant aspirants to American citizenship based their claims to eligibility on alleged African descent, although one could have become a citizen by proving that one was of African descent. Rather, all but one of the 52 applicants whose cases were heard in American courts argued and sought to prove that they were white. Even those who had already succeeded in gaining recognition as white feared the possibility of losing it. Thus, in response to the court's initial refusal to recognize Syrians as white, a prominent Jewish leader expressed his fear that if the Japanese and the Syrians were definitively declared Asians, quote, it will not be a far step to declare the Jews Asiatic. As Sarah Galtieri demonstrates in her important story, a study of early 20th century Syrian immigrants, old world conceptions of difference that had been rooted in religion were quickly Americanized and gave way to a new racial awareness and became increasingly invested in whiteness. Being invested in whiteness, however, was and is not the same as being invested in race. For as Richard Dyer points out, and I quote here, to say that one is interested in race in America has come to mean that one is interested in any racial imagery other than that of white people. In other words, it is only non-whites who are understood to be raced. Whiteness, in a sense, constitute the invisible race. This has a number of serious implications. First, race is largely a non-white category and a non-white concern. Second, whiteness is the invisible American race. To be white is to be normal, to be the product not of history, but rather of nature. This empowers white people to speak for humanity as a whole. And by the way, I've been doing some reading lately on certain critiques of human rights as a construct. And one of the major critiques of the human rights construct is that it essentially identifies the European Union as a universal union. It empowers Europeans to speak for humanity as a whole, and what they understand to be rights must be accepted as rights in a universal context for all peoples. Race people, on the other hand, can only speak for their particular group. Thirdly, and this is one of the implications of all of this, to pursue, therefore, and accept induction into American whiteness is not to engage in any political act, nor to assume any role in any political contest. One is not taking part in political contestations between whites and non-whites. Rather, what one is simply doing is assuming one's natural role in the social political order of America. challenge. Simply stated, Muslim immigrants to the United States are not only socially non-white, socially, legally white, socially non-white, post 9/11. Not only are they socially non-white, they are also legally and socially non-black. On this reality, one might say that they are in fact socially unraced. For many Muslims, this is not only unproblematic, it is actually normative. For them, race is the peculiar, odd, and thoroughly un-Islamic obsession of bigoted American rednecks and hypersensitive blacks. However, if Jacobson and other scholars are right, and America invariably operates on the basis of a distinctly racial understanding of difference, then race must, at least as a matter of fact, be recognized as an operative aspect of American reality. Muslim immigrants may be unraced in the sense that they remain diffident towards or opposed to any explicitly racial, i.e. non-white commitments. But this does not mean that Americans as a whole will not socially racialize immigrant Muslims. And to the extent that such social racialization is inevitable, Muslims may be remiss in remaining racially agnostic and refusing or failing to explore the implications, liabilities, and opportunities that attend this predicament. Yet an exploration that limits itself to the role and power of American whiteness is bound to fall short, given the myopic vision of race that whiteness tends to promote. Thus, I shall argue that one must look beyond whiteness to the role and impact of American blackness and American social political history and identity formation. Now, as with race in general, and I hope everyone's listening very carefully here, I must pause here for another explanatory note. My point in highlighting the function of American blackness is emphatically not to elevate black Americans above any other people. Certainly not in terms of any inherent quality that black Americans might be presumed to possess as a biological race. In fact, my focus here is not on American blackness as a biological fact, but rather as an historical fact and an inextricably American social political experience. As an American phenomenon, blackness has been part of the experience of both blacks and whites. In fact, more than any other non-whiteness, it has contributed to the very meaning and function of whiteness itself. It is this capacity, and in this capacity, American blackness not only informs American self-understanding, it underwrites a number of immovable American realities, sensitivities, tendencies, norms, and possibilities, all of which are summarily blocked from view by a single-minded focus on American whiteness. Given the limitations of space, I will limit myself here to a brief admiration of 5 implications of American blackness. First, American blackness represents not simply the possibility, but the actual fact of multiple American racial authenticities. Here, in fact, the utility of lumping America together with Europe as collectively the West reaches its point of diminishing return. For while whiteness may remain the primary racial connotation of American, it is not the only racial identity that connotes America. Martin Luther King Jr., Snoop Dogg, Muhammad Ali, and countless others are equally connotative of America. In fact, not only do these personalities connote America, they connote only America, not the West, and not even Africa at first blush. Indeed, one is reminded here of the powerful insight of James Baldwin, and I quote here, "Negroes," back in the 60s, "do not exist in any other country." All of this is another way of saying that, unlike their presence in Europe, blacks in America thoroughly frustrate the attempt to limit America to a single racial authenticity. Indeed, they represent the fact that there are at least 2 racially authentic Americans. And this is perhaps why it is primarily white people and black people who are now routinely asked the question, "Where are you emancipation to descent. Simply stated, Black Americans boast a publicly recognized identity and difference that was fired out of a centuries-long experience in America. While Arabs and Indo-Pakistanis also have hyphenated American identities and difference, the perception is that the discordant element in these identities were largely brought to America from without. On this perception, the more Arab or Pakistani Americans indulge their native cultural idiosyncrasies, for example, speaking Arabic or Urdu, or eating biryani, whatever, the less American they are likely to be perceived to be by the dominant culture. By contrast, the more Black Americans speak Ebonics, or Black English, eat fried chicken, whatever, being stereotypical here, the more American, as opposed to African, they are perceived to be. In sum, whereas American belongingness and authenticity for Black Americans is easily reconciled with a degree of divergence from the American cultural norm, it is precisely their acumen at conforming to that norm that confers belongingness and authenticity upon Arabs and Indo-Pakistanis. Third, even as it represents the reality of non-white American authenticity, American Blackness provides an entree into the live possibility of non-white Westernness. This is a controversial issue, and many Black Americans remain resistant to this thesis. Much of this fades, however, on the recognition that Black routes, that is, the routes that one takes to Black Americanness, are as informative of Black Americanness as are Black roots, i.e. Africa. Equally vindicating is the recognition that as Westerners, Black Americans are not mere consumers of some prefabricated Western civilization, but rather co-producers of Western civilization as the masses around the world have presently come to know. In the case of the U.S. in particular, American pop culture, for example, in the view of many Americans, or in the view of many around the world, America's most prized and seductive export, this pop culture would be unimaginable absent the contributions of Black Americans. Thus, Ali Masrui, for example, once referred to Black Americans as Afro-Saxons. And Amiri Baraka, Leroy Jones, would speak of the transformation of Black Africans into a Western people. None of this is to argue, of course, that Black Westerners is identical with white Westerners. But this is precisely the point. Black American Westerners constitutes an alternative modality of Westerners. Ultimately, a different way of understanding, of being, feeling, and thinking Western. Fourth, American Blackness fundamentally informs the national conscience of America. In this capacity, it contributes in a major way to denying Americans the kind of innocence required to create and exploit problem peoples. Problem peoples are those who are deemed to possess such incontrovertibly negative qualities that those who criticize and demand change in them enjoy the luxury of seeing themselves as wholly justified, being motivated neither by prejudice, interest, nor ignorance, but by unspoiled conscience alone. On this perspective, all of the labor falls upon the problem people, that is, to change what is wrong about them, while the critics are called upon to do nothing but monitor the efforts of their presumed inferiors. To be sure, America has produced problem peoples in the past, and it is Blackness more than anything else that reminds her of this unlovely fact. To deny race, on the other hand, and thus Blackness, is to afford America the luxury of innocence born of historical amnesia, thus facilitating the enterprise of creating yet another problem people. In fact, short of the reminder of Blackness, it will likely be easier to shift the blame for any new bigotry to the new problem people. For whereas every negative stereotype hurled at the Negro could be turned with a modicum of effort into an indictment of what America herself had created, no such stigma is likely to attach to warning Americans about terrorists, violent extremists, Islamofascists, and threats to national security. Finally, If whiteness is invisible as essentially a non-race, blackness is the quintessential American race. Racism in America is thus quintessentially an anti-black offense, first and foremost. At bottom, the American quest for redemption is essentially a desire to rewrite its racist past. And there are two competing approaches to doing this. First, and this one is favored more by conservatives, is to deny the basic fact of the past by shifting responsibility for black American woes entirely to black Americans. This is partly achieved by holding up the example of other socially non-white groups who have excelled in America, albeit under entirely different circumstances. The second approach, and this is favored more by liberals, is to try to undo the effects of the past by more effectively integrating black Americans into positions of power, wealth, and influence. On both approaches, however, it is ultimately blackness that humbles America, pricks her conscience, and reminds her that even when she is most sure of herself, proudest and most satisfied with her achievements, most certain of her might and the righteousness of her cause, she remains capable of great evil and lapses of moral judgment, for which she may ultimately need to redeem herself. My point in what I have said so far is neither to encourage immigrant Muslims to reposition themselves as blacks, nor to imply or to suggest that they could actually do so. My point is simply that understanding America through the prism of race, and most specifically American blackness, provides useful and meaningful insights and holds out possibilities and alternatives hitherto overlooked or blocked from consideration. I would like now to turn to how Muslim immigrant communities might relate to some of these insights and these possibilities. Beginning with the possibility of multiple American authenticities. Clearly, this should be of interest to Muslim immigrants who, on the one hand, want to be included as part of America, but who, as Muslims, want to be free to dissent from America without being resented as racial or social political apostates. Here, in fact, we come face to face with one of the more problematic aspects of Muslim inclusion in American whiteness. In sum, whiteness provides both limited inclusion and even more limited right to dissent. In fact, the very threat of exclusion can serve as a major incentive for compromising the integrity of one's faith. In other words, one may find oneself in the position of being able to prove one's loyalty and commitment to a white worldview and cultural orthodoxy to which one is supposed to belong, only by relaxing one's public commitments to Islam or forfeiting one's right to dissent. By contrast, blackness not only negates the exclusive authority of white cultural orthodoxy, it suggests the possibility of reconciling dissent with belongingness and the theoretical possibility of generating American authenticities that lie beyond both blackness and whiteness. On the matter of American national conscience, one need only consider the kinds of vitriol that can be spewed about Islam and Muslims with impunity, and compare this with what can be said about blacks or any other race for our race. Again, my point here is not to extol blackness, but to point out, or to point to, what is forfeited by the racial nausea embraced by many Muslims in America. By allowing America to feign colorblindness, one allows her the advantage of assuming innocence as her point of departure. From here, it is only Islam and Muslims and Sharia, etc., that need to adjust and apologize, while anti-Muslim bigotry is effectively placed beyond critique. Even Islamophobia can be denied on the argument that American fears about Islam and Muslims are not irrational, but quite founded. By contrast, when House Majority Leader Trent Lott remarked as early as 2002, less than a decade ago, that we would have avoided many problems had we listened to the suggestions of the famous segregationist Ron Furman, Lott was relieved of his post as Senate Majority Leader. Imagine what would have happened if Lott had simply stated that we would have avoided many of the problems that we are now facing had we listened to those who oppose rescinding imagine what would have happened had they turned out to be Arab or Indo-Pakistani. Clearly, inclusion in American whiteness does not provide Muslims with this kind of insulation. The question, therefore, is where do American Muslims go from here? And how can American non-Muslims be most effectively brought face to face with the fact of their anti-Muslim bigotry? Regarding the issue of the possibility of alternative modalities of Westerners, this is a huge matter for which space will not allow a full treatment. 3 quick points, however, may begin to light the way. First, without the possibility of non-white Western authenticity, the alienation that continues to haunt so many Muslim immigrant youth will continue unabated, such alienation being fertile ground for seeds of radical extremism and violence. Second, without the possibility of genuine non-white Westerners, there can be no real, credible, effective, internal Muslim critique of Western thought and institutions. External critique will continue, to be sure. But given the imbalance in cultural and intellectual authority between the Muslim world and the West, this is not likely to go very far. Third, without the possibility of non-white Westerners, one can only wonder about the possibility of genuine organic group alliances between Muslims and non-Muslims in America. Black Americans already have, including Black American Muslims, their natural ally in the form of the Black American community at large. Who will play this role for Muslims who immigrated to this country from elsewhere? Finally, on the question of American redemption, refusing to recognize race allows Americans to conduct themselves in essentially racist ways while being able to deny racism and thus the propriety of any redress. In other words, there is nothing in their treatment of Islam or Muslims for which Islamophobic Americans need to redeem themselves. Part of the key to all of this, however, is the effective erasure of blackness and race from the national conscience and discourse. This is why one of the arguments routinely adduced to deny that Islamophobia has anything to do with racism is to insist that Islam is not a race. Once race and blackness are removed from consideration, so too is the need for any vigilance, discipline, or redemption. Anti-Muslim bigots are simply able to relocate the problem in the despised Muslims themselves. Given their alien status as socially neither black nor white, and given that they are now taken to be the representatives of Islam, Arabs are particularly vulnerable to the kinds of stereotype and demagogic vilification that follows from this. In fact, at the risk of wearing out my welcome at this late stage, let me just end here with a brief example that will hopefully demonstrate my point. On September 22nd, 2008, less than 2 months before the presidential election, conservative pundit Rush Limbaugh delivered a message designed to turn white voters away from presidential candidate Barack Obama. Limbaugh noted that many, particularly white blue-collar workers, could not bring themselves to vote for Obama because he was black. He also said, however, that the number of whites who were alienated by Obama's blackness might not be enough to ensure a McCain victory. So he set out to find a more secure basis for turning white voters away from Obama. During the course of his radio broadcast, he declared the following, and I'm quoting here, and the best Rush Limbaugh voice that I ever must have. These polls will have 1/3 of blue-collar white Democrats won't vote for Obama because he's black. But he's not black. Do you know he has not one shred of African blood? He doesn't have any African. That's why when they asked whether he was authentic, whether he's down for the struggle, he's Arab. You know, he's from Africa. He's from Arab parts of Africa. He's not, his followers, he's not African American. The last thing he is African American. End of quote. To be sure, Limbaugh is a shrewd propagandist who knows his audience and his craft quite well. In order to augment the number of whites who would not vote for Obama, he deemed it necessary to negate Obama's blackness and to affirm that Obama was an Arab. Of course, Limbaugh knew that he was misrepresenting Obama. In an earlier broadcast on August 19, 2008, he complained that no Democrat, and I'm quoting here, had the guts to stand up and say no to a black guy. So he knew that Obama was black. By late September, however, he realized that America was serious about seizing this historical opportunity for redemption. He also recognized, however, that the redemption vote could be undermined if he could find a way to negate the very basis of any need for redemption. By insisting that Obama was not black, in other words, Limbaugh was implying that there would be no redemption in voting for him. Then, in order to reinforce this negation, he set out to place Obama in a category he deemed least likely to elicit any American empathy. From here, not only could the most ridiculous things be said, believed, and feared about Obama, this could be executed with total impunity. To conclude, from 1790 up until 1952, race remained an explicit constituent of the definition of an American. The National Origins Act of 1924 was basically an implicit extension of this policy. Thus, in effect, race continued to play an official role up until 1965. In this light, I have argued that race is integral to American reality. Moreover, I have implied that there can be no effective or responsible thinking about Islam in America, including the possibility of altering the Islamophobic present without coming to terms with the reality of race, engaging it, and assessing the nature and utility of recognizing this basic fact. Of course, this is not likely to sit with those Muslims who hold that as a universal religion for all peoples, all times, and all places, Islam simply does not and cannot do race. In response to these people, I would simply submit that beyond the fundamentals, beyond its fundamentals, and the concrete consensus reached by Muslims in real space and time, Islam as a totally undifferentiated and uniform entity is nothing but an imagined abstraction. In America, Islam will have to engage race, just as Islam in many parts of the Muslim world must engage and has engaged the reality of tribe. And here I must admit that I do not see any functional difference between the two, especially if we separate race from racism, in the same way that we separate tribe and the value of tribal belongingness from various negative forms of tribalism. But even beyond the significance of race for Muslims in America, I believe that race is important for America as a whole, as the most likely and efficient instrumentality for keeping America honest, humble, vibrantly pluralistic, and necessarily committed to a negotiated over a superimposed national identity. Just as tribe and tribal unity could be challenged to positive ends in the Prophet Muhammad's Arabia of the 7th century, so might race in modern America be so challenged. In fact, on this understanding, race, as I have suggested earlier, may ultimately prove to be America's unwitting gift to herself. And I'm thinking here especially when we think about the differences between America and Europe right now. For on the one hand, power, wealth, and influence, short of conscience, naturally court disaster for any nation. Race, meanwhile, and most especially American blackness, is a major preservative of American historical memory and a reliable animator of American national conscience. On the other hand, the natural order of society is in fact diversity. How much, when, why, and how long diversity must yield to the value of unity is among the defining features of the challenge of modernity. In America, the nativistic and often tyrannically homogenizing ambitions of the majority, along with its promises of false inclusion, will always smack up against and be retarded by the nagging nemesis and that there are two mics on either side for those who might have questions, which I hope that I will be able to answer.
My name is Elise Siddiqui, and I'm not asking you a question, but I want to congratulate you. So subtly pointing to the Muslims of America, what they need to do. And I wrote down a few lines while you were speaking, that the recognition that Black Americans have received are due to their unique positive, more than negative cultural contributions to America. And that, namely in music, dance, sport, and the various kinds of ethnic foods they have brought, and we all call that as America. What Muslims are contributing is unfortunately more negative than positive cultural contributions, namely terrorism, condemning or looking condescendingly at the white American culture, and peculiar dress codes of them which isolate them and prevent them from making a unified culture and acceptance in this community, and their subjugation of the female or segregation of the female in common gatherings. I'd like you to say I'm right or wrong on that.
How long do I have? Wow. You mentioned a lot there, and it's a lot to try to retain at one time. I'll just respond based on the impressions that are left in my mind from your statement. The first thing I want to say is that I think it's unfair to say that Muslims have contributed nothing positively to America. I think that's blatantly unfair. I'll get to some of the problems. I'm not trying to whitewash some of the difficulties that Muslims are encountering in America today, but I'll just remind you of something. If in America you were to have a Muslim strike day, no Muslims go to work, just stay home and blizz in front of the television or something, I guess, you would probably have to shut down half of American hospitals. This is a major reality. So I think that the whole notion that Muslims have and continue to contribute nothing positive to America, I personally don't agree with that. Now, second, I think that where Muslims are culturally in America, and I'm not going to rehearse the thesis that I laid out in Islam and Black America, I think that there are cultural dislocations in the Muslim community. And part of the reason for that is that Muslim communities who immigrated to America from the Muslim world have imagined, quote-unquote, Islamic culture to be one black box manifestation. And that is Islamic culture as existed in whatever country they happen to come from. And it's been it's a very difficult transition to let go of something when that to which you're supposed to be trying to attach yourself is itself not fully formed yet. And so I think that American Muslims are culturally in a transitionary stage. They are trying to find avenues to healthy cultural expressions of Islam in America that resonate in an American context, but that also reflect their values and sensibilities as Muslims. And I don't think that we should forget the fact that if critical masses of Muslims do not begin to settle in America until 1965, all right, Muslims have been here less than half a century. So there's some time that's going to be required for this to come about. Now, none of that is to make excuses. And if I thought that excuses were enough, I wouldn't be up here saying some of the rather dangerous things that I've said. And I think that some of the issues that you point out, the laziness in terms of how we think about Islam in the context of America, the unwillingness or the inability to take America as seriously as our homeland, all right, as we take other parts of the Muslim world. We have to remember that Islam, by the time that the Prophet died, had only one sort of homeland. That was Arabia. And not all Arabia at that. Islam had to go into all of these different countries, all right, and process these cultures in light of its own religious sensibilities, out of which you get, this beautiful collage of what became Muslim cultures and societies. I see no reason why that process should stop at the shores of the Atlantic. That process has to continue here in America. And one of the things that retards that process is that, again, America is very unique among Western democracies. This is the only democracy that has a major segment of its Muslims coming from an indigenous population. You don't have that in place else. You don't have that in France. You don't have that in Germany. You don't have that in England. They're all immigrants. Here, black Americans born, raised in America, have been here for centuries, a major constituent of the American Muslim community. Why has the cultural genius, and I mean that, I use that word neutrally, of this group of Muslims been ignored, if not suppressed? I think that what we need to understand is that part of the future of America, part of the future of America, but of Islam in America, will be determined not simply by what Muslims can come up with in terms of this ruling or that ruling at Islamic law, but whether or not Muslims can actually produce a livable social and cultural order. That more than anything else will determine the future of this community in America. I hope I answered this summary.
Thank you so much for coming. My question is, for Muslim Americans to invest in blackness, how much of that process will require them to internalize the historical realities of Black America, including the suffering and the oppression, and how much of that, in that process, will there be potential for mistrust between Black Muslims and non-Black Muslims?
Well, I don't propose that this whole enterprise is a problem-free, easy enterprise to undertake. I don't think that, by the way, I'm glad you asked that question. I'm not a politician, but I really am glad you asked that question. Because I do want to make clear, it's not as important to me that immigrant Muslims internalize, as it were, the Black experience. It's important for them to understand the Black experience, but to understand the Black experience not simply as a Black experience, but as an American experience. All right? This happened in America. This is our history. This is who we are. All right? Now, how do we position ourselves as Muslims to recognize that fact and to make sure that our contributions are such that we go in a positive direction, notwithstanding our past, as opposed to a negative direction? If you ask any number of Black Americans, and by the way, I'm always, what's the word I'm looking for here? Not flabbergasted, but I'm just all over at the number of whites that I encounter on a daily basis who see clearly, straight to the core, the racist underpinnings of Islamophobia in America. That this is not something new, all right? It's just a new victim. All right? Muslims who came to this country and ignored America, all right, did not understand, perhaps because it didn't affect them, all right, that this kind of tendency existed in our society, and that we don't collectively conduct ourselves in a way to minimize the negative effects of that, it will rear its head again. All right? That's what I think that Muslims have to understand. I also think, however, that, Muslims come to America and enjoy untold advantages. And I've lived in the Muslim world for years. So I know. And I can tell you, when I go abroad, you can take my shoes, you can take my money, don't take Big Blue. I don't know if you know what Big Blue is. But don't mess with that passport, because I'm going home after this is all over. So Muslims enjoy untold advantages. Muslims have to recognize, however, just like the Prophet did when he went from that in the same way that I fully partake of the advantages of America, I am also responsible, all right, for the failures of America. And I'm also involved, therefore, in that quest to make right, or to do right on those failures. Not simply here to take, all right, and not contribute to the cumulative, record of America's attempt to live up to her own ideals. That's what I think is important about Muslims understanding the black experience. All right? A white American Muslim told me this. You remember the Part 51 thing was going on? Ground Zero Mosque? Oh, that's right. That was overshadowed by your own local event. Anyway, a white American Muslim said to me that, Muslims somehow don't seem to quite understand. They think that Islamophobia is something new. All right? The reality is that there has always been a bigotry addict in our midst in America. The Civil Rights Movement sent that bigotry addict into rehab. Now he's back out, and he's all about again. And so white American Muslims said this to me, and what we have to understand is that this exists. And collectively, we have to make our contribution to making sure that the bigotry addicts don't get out of rehab and wreak havoc on society. And it might not be you, it may be somebody else. It's still the bigotry addict, and that's still a liability for us all. Alright? And I'll say something here that, it's not often popular in certain circles. It's people like Abraham Joshua Heschel, the Jewish rabbi, who I'm often extremely admirable of. I admire the fact that he's a man who came to America after the time that Jews had succeeded in gaining admission into American whiteness. Could have simply, I'm white, let me go and do my thing. And yeah, I know there's some bad things happening out there, but they don't affect me. And go on about his life. This man marched with Martin Luther King. Alright? And that is the moral caliber of Muslims that we need to be critiquing. Not just about Muslims. Alright? But about anybody who's a victim of that bigotry addict that has been running around in our country virtually from the beginning. I hope that answers your question.
How much of identifying with that previous black experience will anchor some in the minimization of how big that was compared to what this is? Compared to what Muslims experience today is not the same as what, black Americans experienced before. And to what extent will that, correlate?
But you see, again, I think that we make a mistake by just focusing on the suffering or the discrimination that certain people are suffering. That's important, yes. But I think we have to focus on where that comes from. We have to focus on, the American reality. All right? We're not the first ones. It's always been here. Don't believe me? Ask the Chinese. Ask the Catholics. Ask the Jews. Ask the Armenians. Ask them all. Yes.
You undercut my point a lot, but
I'm sorry?
You undercut my point. That was made a lot, but that's quite all right. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate what you had to say. In my experience, it's been that America is less of. I was always taught that America is a melting pot. That there isn't one race, there isn't one creed, there isn't one anything that quantifies America. That it's more of an idea. That the Statue of Liberty and what's written on the Statue of Liberty, that's America. Out of many one, that's America. And you're right, over the course of American history, there's always been an other. It's really easy to point at someone else and say, that's the bad guy, that's the bad one. But it's my understanding that it's the ideal of out of many one, that we're all one people,
think that, the melting pot metaphor is so seductive that it often passes without any kind of serious examination. I mean, if America is a melting pot, who controls the flame? Who controls how fast we melt, what we melt into, and what that product ultimately is. I think that. Okay, I'm going to stop. I'm always going to be nervous. I'm sorry. I tend to go with the whole idea, the metaphor of America as a salad bowl, because I think that one has to be very careful. When we say Hitler was Una, somebody's defining that Una. I mean, why did Jews change their names? Not just Jews, but Jews. I mean, all kinds of people. Why? What was wrong with their name? Why did they have to change their name to become something else in order to be admitted into the Una? Well, we think that this Una is harmless. It's not harmless. All right? And why do we so mindlessly, in many instances, endorse this notion of from the many one? How about from the many, many? I'm very serious about that. This is not just rhetorical. I mean, I'm a black American. That's a very deeply rooted American identity. There are white Americans who have a very deeply rooted American authentic identity, and that's all right. And we get together and enjoy each other. But he's not me, and I'm not him. What's wrong with that? We don't have to be the same to be American. Just imagine that. Every restaurant you go to is the same food. So I think that part of what I would like to see us do is to think beyond some of those traditional ideas that we have imbibed, presumably for the purpose of preserving this union. All right? Because, and I'll stop on this note, I really will. We have to be careful about mistaking acquiescence for agreement. If you are powerful enough, and that power does not have to be manifested in terms of brute force, all right? It can simply be the power that comes from your ability to withdraw validation from people who need or seek validation, all right? If you are powerful enough, you can coerce people into acquiescence. They will look like they agree, but they are simply acquiescing. Acquiescence can only last for so long. That's what we're seeing in Egypt right now. So I think we have to be careful about getting stuck in 19th century notions, early 20th century notions, all right, in ways that deny us avenues to becoming all that we can be. All right? This is my country. This is my home. All right? This is where I'm going to die, inshallah. My children, my grandchildren are going to die. All right? But I do not think that, culturally speaking, that everybody who wants to be an authentic American has to be like me. So I'd like us to entertain the notion from the many, many Americans.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson, so much for your very informational lecture. Can we give one more round of applause for Dr. Jackson? I apologize for someone keeping you off stage. I'm sorry. Before we commence the lecture, I have a couple of announcements on behalf of IOC. Hello? Sorry. Our next event is next week, Tuesday, February 15th. We'll be screening a movie called Bilal Stan, which is about a young Muslim who is in high school and wants to go to college, but he can't afford it, essentially speaking. So he's in a college application, and he gets in, but he has to find money for it. So it's his adventure of how to balance family life with possibly going to college. It's at 8 8 p.m. in the Auditorium, and it's co-sponsored with Royal Entertainment. Our second lecture event will be on February 16th. It's called Islam 101. So basically, if you have any questions about Islam, this is the event you should probably go to. It will feature Dr. Ali Shadata, and it will be at 7 p.m. in the Grand Ballroom. And to find out more about these events, go to www.islamoncampus.com. I'll say that one more time. www.islamoncampus.com. Also, if you are here for extra credit, please don't forget to sign in at the front desk downstairs, so that way you can get your HO. Also, Dr. Jackson's books one of his books are on sale downstairs, so you have books that will be providing them, so if you'd like to purchase a copy, you can just make your way downstairs and get that as well. Oh yeah, also, I don't know if you can see this, but this is an awesome button, right? And it says Islam Awareness Month. So if you haven't already, pick up a button. There are some out on the outside tables. And second to last, we'll be having our Isha prayer, our final prayer, here on the stage, which is kind of odd, but we'll be having it on stage. But before we do that, I'd like to invite Sister Summer Iqbal. She has something very legitastic for you to see on stage, and she'll explain it in more detail. So with that said, Sister Summer Iqbal. This is our Muslim mosaic. As it is Islam Awareness Month, we have an overall theme for the month, and that's the Muslim mosaic. So what we've done is that for every event we're holding throughout this month, we're having a little piece that represents the event. This is a silhouette. I don't know if you guys can see from where you are, but it actually has swirls of color that are flowing up, and they're to represent different cultures, different races, and different faiths. Living together cohesively to create a really pretty graphic. So we're inshallah going to be adding this to our mosaic, and as the event goes on, as the month goes on, it'll all come together to be one whole, sort of representing the picture for everything we've talked about this month. So here's the picture. Thank you all very much for coming, and if you come to our events on If you come to the events on the 15th and 16th, you'll start to see what's going to be coming on the left side of the mosaic. So be sure to come out. Keep them up.